Hell Yes Life, episode 30. Welcome to the Hell Yes Life podcast, the show that helps you come alive so you can live a Hell Yes life. I'm your host, Norman Bell. Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Hell Yes Life podcast. I am your host, Norman Bell, and hell yes, I am glad that you are here today. This is the place to hear inspiring stories and actionable tips from our amazing guests that will motivate you to live your Hell Yes Life. The Hell Yes Life podcast releases new episodes every Tuesday and sporadically on Thursdays and Fridays. And Hell Yes Lifers, if you want to write a review of the Hell Yes Life podcast, please visit hellyeslife.com/HYL iTunes. That's /HYL iTunes. Also, if you've been listening to Hell Yes Life podcast and you're getting inspired by our guests and you're starting to think to yourself, hey, I want to live my Hell Yes Life, but I don't know how to go about doing it, well, then I have good news for you. Right now on hellyeslife.com, you can sign up for a free 5-part video mini course that will walk you through the 5 steps to a Hell Yes Life. The course will help you find your Hell Yes, create your cringeworthy vision, build your Hell Yes day, and plan your first Hell Yes action, and much more. If you're ready to jumpstart your Hell Yes life, then head over to hellyeslife.com right now. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Hell Yes Lifers, I am so excited to share with you my conversation with our guest this week, Cathy O'Dowd. Cathy O'Dowd is the first woman in the world to climb Mount Everest from both its north and south sides. She was also on the mountain in 1996 during the infamous storm that took the lives of several people and inspired the book Into Thin Air and the movie Everest. In the late 1990s, Cathy was completing her master's degree in media studies in South Africa when she saw a newspaper advertisement for a place on the first South African Everest expedition. 6 months later, she became the first South African to summit Mount Everest. 3 years later, she became the first woman in the world to climb the mountain from both sides. Cathy has been a professional speaker for nearly 20 years and has presented her message to companies in over 40 countries on 6 continents. She has written a book about her Everest experiences called Just for the Love of It. Now, in our conversation, we discuss how Cathy ended up joining the first ever South African Mount Everest expedition, what happened on the mountain during the infamous storm of 1996 and during her own summit experience, what we can do when we face enormous challenges while we're pursuing our passion, how we can achieve any goal, even climbing Mount Everest, by taking one step at a time, and much more. Again, I'm really looking forward to sharing this conversation with you, Hell Yes Lifers, so let's dive in. Cathy O'Dowd, welcome to the Hell Yes Life podcast. Are you ready to tell us about your Hell Yes Life?
I'd be delighted.
Oh, very good, Cathy. Great to hear that. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to share your story with our listeners. I always like to start off by asking our guests, what is your Hell Yes? And by that, I mean, what is your passion, that thing that really makes you come alive?
I think it's essentially journeying through mountains. And I don't mean at the sort of going for a walk, by the edge of the road in the mountains. I mean journeying in complex, difficult, remote locations. That's what I find really inspiring. On foot, on skis, rock climbing, alpine climbing, whatever it takes.
I almost hesitated to ask that question because it seemed like pretty obvious what it is based on your background. But I always like to start off that way. Now, before we're going to get into your story and all the, adventures that you've had and everything you've done since. But I'd like to ask, when was the first time you realized this was your Hell Yes, your passion?
It sort of grew on me. And I think other people might have noticed before I did. I started rock climbing in university, and then I started going on expeditions, which was fairly tricky from South Africa because we were having to go to South America. And that meant, so Southern Hemisphere, our mid-year exams are at a different time of year from you guys in the North. 2 years running, I missed my mid-year exams and got them to agree to let me sit the later resit because I was away on expedition. And I remember going to one of my history professors to complain about the fact that I never seemed to quite get a first. The way we divided them, first was the top level, and I kept getting upper second, which is the next level down, and being just sort of 1 percentage point short of getting firsts. And I went and asked him why. And he just looked at me and said, if you put the same passion into your history that you seem to put into climbing those mountains of yours, you'd do just fine. I was like, yeah, okay, maybe I do spend quite a lot of time running off to climb mountains.
Okay, so that's great. That's where we started. But I actually want to back up even a little bit more. So you started going on expeditions to South America, and I do this for the benefit of our listeners out there who, obviously very few people get to where you've gone with mountain climbing. But let's say there's somebody out there that's they've got a little vision in their mind of the mountains, and it's just not going away, but they haven't really taken any big action on it. When was that time in your life? Was it, so there you were in South Africa, so there's not that many mountains in South Africa to climb. Is that right?
It's not bad actually for mountains. What there isn't is a great deal of snow. So it doesn't really allow you to ski or do glacier climbing, alpine climbing. Mm-hmm. Again, it crept up on me. Mm-hmm. This wasn't, some blinding vision I had since the age of 6 or anything like that. It started with a summer camp, an adventure camp when I was 14 in the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa. And I got to climb and camp and hike and thought all of this was interesting. And then I didn't get another chance until I got to university because back then there were no indoor climbing walls or commercial trips or anything like this. So my next chance was university, the rock climbing club. And even then I didn't realize what it was going to mean. I was terrible at sport at school. I can't connect with balls. I have poor coordination. I hate team sport. I don't like the rah-rah of sort of win-lose team sport, competitive sport. And rock climbing was just this wonderful personal journey into the wilderness combined with this challenging physical and mental puzzle solving as you try and find your way up this natural rock wall while working out the safety for if or when something goes wrong and you end up falling off, which happens. And I just found that so intriguing, so fulfilling. It requires such a clarity of focus when you're doing it. You can't be doing it and have 100 things running in the back of your mind. Mm-hmm. And then it was curiosity. It said, well, okay, if climbing, 20 meters of rock is interesting, what would it be like to climb 100 meters of rock or 500 meters? And then, okay, well, some people go off and climb snow and ice. There isn't any in South Africa, but okay, Central Africa. There's some glaciers up on the equator. Let's go there. That was my first expedition. And then it's like, wow, 5,000 meters in Africa. Let's try 6,000 meters in the Andes and see what that's like. So it's always been a journey. Good. Thanks for kind of drilling down into that a little bit. So it was that curiosity, right? You had those first experiences of doing that rock climbing, and then at some point, because you could have stayed with rock climbing, right? Obviously, there's plenty of people who are avid rock climbers and never go on to the ice climbing, but at some point, you started to get curious about this next step, right? Ice climbing, and then it went on from there. Great. Thanks for sharing that. So now, can you give me, again, we'll get into the different stories, whatever you really want to talk about. But can you give us an overview of what is life like in the world of Cathy O'Dowd? Well, I went on from that curious journey into the mountains to become the first South African to climb Everest. A couple of years later, the first woman in the world to climb Everest from both south and north sides. And off the back, particularly actually of the first South African Everest descent, I was able to publish a book and to start giving motivational presentations to big corporations. And that was 21 years ago. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Wow.
I pay the bills. I pay the mortgage. I keep the cat and cat food. I finance my expeditions, essentially, off my corporate speaking. And that's now taken me, I think, to 44 countries for paid speeches. An extraordinary range of organizations. It's like I get to bungee jump briefly into the whole high-end multinational corporate world, have a look around and go like, oh, I'm glad somebody else is doing this because I don't want to. And then go back to living in the Pyrenees Mountains in Europe and going off and climbing things and climbing up them and skiing back down them. So I've been self-employed my entire adult life. I've made it work. I've managed to change continents and take my career my career with me. I've managed to leverage it to pay the bills, build up the pension, pay off the mortgage, but also allow me to keep on traveling and climbing and exploring. It's a pretty good life.
Cathy, that sounds like a hell yes life to me. I'm sure it does to our listeners as well. So let's see. Where do we want to go? Do you want to talk about your Tell me a little bit more about your speaking. So, again, I think we'll touch on this kind of some of the key stories from your climbing days in a moment. But what is it how have you translated your experience mountain climbing into making presentations in a corporate setting? What are the themes that you talk about?
Well, I focused in on talking about team dynamics and leading and building effective teams. Because I think there are essentially two problems with people like me who want to be on the international speaking circuit. I mean, the circuit is big. There are a lot of conferences, but then again, there are thousands and thousands of speakers. And there are new ones coming up all the time, and everyone's got their 15 minutes of fame after you won your Olympic medal, or you were the first person in your country to climb Everest, or whatever it was. One of the biggest challenges for people like us is how do you extend the 15 minutes? How do you turn it into 20 years? And the problem is it can't just be about me. It can't be, I went, I climbed, now you guys can be inspired by me. You've got to be hell of a famous for that to work. And the other thing with companies is, or certainly in Europe, they're less sold on individual achievement and they're more interested in managing and leading teams. I think the US is slightly different. I do some work in the US, but I do much more in Europe. But overall, if you want a long career, it can't just be about you. It's got to be about understanding what in your experience resonates with the problems your corporate client is trying to solve. And my crossover point is essentially, okay, big project, big goal, big stress, big risk. Small team of highly ambitious, egotistical, overconfident A-type characters. And you as the leader are stuck with these guys. And you're trying to get them to collaborate for the greater good of the project rather than just compete with each other and pursue their individual ambition and go running off up the mountain in a fit of overconfidence. And, these people, because they're top performers, they're just not that easy to manage. And this is where it gets interesting. Talking about these kinds of people on these kinds of projects. What makes it work? How do you get the best out of them? What are the things that go wrong? Because believe me, we don't need the mountain to throw problems at us. We create our own problems through ego and infighting and power plays and poor communication. There's a whole lot of drama that goes on expeditions that people don't always hear about. So I give very honest presentations talking about those problems, talking about how you manage them. And people love it because it's so different. It's exciting, it's dramatic, it's unusual, But then at its essence, it's about the same kind of people facing the same kind of problems, searching for the same sort of solutions.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, just I can totally imagine actually a corporate audience really, well, one, the material you're talking about is so compelling. There's something about Everest and high mountain climbing that is so captivating. But I can see how you can translate that into, you can imagine teams with lots of strong personalities trying to work things out, and that your presentations would be very useful. I do want to go back a little bit, and I want to be mindful that your life for you is more than Mount Everest. I want to touch on your time with Mount Everest a little bit, and then we can talk a little bit more about your other climbing experiences since then. But you've got a couple of stories in there that are too good to pass up. So can you take us back to your first climb on Mount Everest and kind of give us a little overview of that experience?
All right. Well, imagine the worst way to get invited to join a national expedition. And the worst way is that they've put together a team of men. They've invited what they assume are the best climbers in the country. And at the last minute, a newspaper, who's one of the sponsors, decides the whole story just doesn't sound all that compelling, really. And let's sex up the coverage by running a competition to find a girl to join the team. And imagine that you are one of 200 women who apply, and you go through a whole selection procedure on television, because this was basically early reality television, and you are selected. So literally 2 months before leaving for Everest, you are parachuted into this team on a wave of media publicity as the token woman chosen through a completely daft newspaper competition. That is not a good dynamic.
Yeah.
That is how I got onto the first South African Everest expedition. So you start like that, and let me say that the best climbers in South Africa turned out to have colossal egos, possibly bigger than their actual experience, and there was some really nasty infighting, not just with me, but within the team. So you take all of that, and you go to Everest in the year of 1996.
Mm-hmm.
So the biggest mountain I've ever climbed is 6,000 meters in the Andes. And I turned up at the foot of Everest, and this is the notorious spring of 1996. They made a Hollywood movie about it about 2 years ago called Everest. It's that spring, and it's that storm.
Yeah.
So our little dysfunctional team walks into the biggest storm in the history of Everest, where 8 climbers from other expeditions will be killed. And we will be sitting at 8,000 meters at Camp 4 through that storm. It was a hell of an introduction to high altitude climbing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And is that right? That, and I just wanted to point out for our listeners that yes, that movie was made about it. And then I read a book, a number of years ago, Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, that was about that disaster. I imagine maybe the movie was somewhat based on that. Is that true that, so the South African team, you guys could have gone up with them, but you chose not to, or you kind of opted out? You were a little bit hesitant to because of the weather. Is that right? Or
yes. That's right. We were one of 4 teams who moved to the top camp on the 9th of May. Ourselves, the Taiwanese, Rob Hall's team, and Scott Fisher's team. And the weather was already somewhat unstable. Now, I'm not in any sense saying that we kind of knew better than Rob Hall or Scott Fisher. What we knew was that we were relatively inexperienced and we needed to be really careful. So it seemed reasonable that the others should go. I mean, they had a lot more experience than we did. We assumed that they were probably going to get it right. And we were quite tempted to sort of follow them, trust their judgment. And that was a difficult conversation, but we eventually decided, no, we stick together as a team, we stick with our own parameters, we play it safe. And yes, thank God we did.
And take us there. I remember I was listening into your interview with Brittany Felix on the Living Unconventionally podcast, and you were talking about how, in a way, that when that and so no, did anyone have any idea that a storm like that was coming through, or did it really just take everybody by complete surprise?
Well, we knew the weather was slightly unstable. This was right at the beginning of anybody having access to satellite weather information. So certainly our team wasn't aware that there was bad weather coming. And I'm not entirely clear how much information they had at Rob Hall's base camp, but I think, again, they had no idea that it was going to turn out to be that bad. So yes, it was a terrible shock to everybody on the mountain.
And I heard you actually describing it as it was in a way. I mean, it was kind of terrifying, but also boring in a way, because from your perspective, obviously all this terrible tragedy is going on outside, but from your perspective, you were hunkered down in a tent, just waiting for the storm to pass. Is that right? Take us to that moment. What was that like?
Well, yes, this is kind of interesting because on one hand, we're in an experience which is pretty terrifying. But on the other hand, nothing's happening. And you actually can't sit there being utterly terrified endlessly. I mean, your body just, I don't know, I can't anyway. So we're sitting there fully dressed because there's the threat that the tents will tear in the storm. And obviously you can't be thrown out into a storm at 8,000 meters in your socks and your thermal underwear. So we're sitting there fully dressed through the night, boring as hell, aware that things are going wrong. But again, we didn't really understand how much was going wrong because there's so little information. I think the people closest to the storm kind of knew the least because there's no communication with other climbers. You don't know where anybody is. You only have the occasional radio call because there's no recharging the radio batteries. You can't waste them just doing endless radio calls. You've got to keep them in case things get even worse. And even when we're doing radio calls, the weather is so bad that mostly you're just getting awful static on the radio and you're hearing the occasional word. So the confusion is enormous. And so, yeah, you're sitting there in the tent through the night, sleepy, confused, worried, bored. Yeah, it's the most bizarre mix of emotions.
So then, so how long did the storm last?
Well, through the night, through the next morning, and then it didn't just stop. It sort of started to tail out. So actually we probably could have managed to go down the next day, but we were so tired and so confused about what was going on that we sort of missed the brief window of slightly better weather and ended up, the weather got worse again. We stayed another night at 8,000 meters, and went down the day after that. Which of course meant that we then had, we'd run through all our supplies up there. So when the time came to decide that we were actually going to, pretty much against most people's advice, we were going to try again, we had to kind of resupply the top camp before we could even think about trying to have another go to get to the top. It's complicated climbing at that altitude.
Extremely so. And what one thing in just reading about everything that you've been through with Everest is it seems like every action that someone takes on Mount Everest is under an extreme microscope. Just the scrutiny of people who are sitting at home in their armchairs are sitting there going, well, they should have done this. They shouldn't have done this. Do you have anything to say about that around this? And then, I was just reading about some of the other climbs, your actual summit experience that year and in other years. It seems like people have lots of opinions. How do you what do you do with that information for people?
Well, this experience, the 1996 Everest climb, was the beginning of the modern age. I think it was almost the first year that expeditions were actually running websites from base camp. And it was right at the beginning of satellite telephones. I mean, satellite telephones were still the size of a massive old-fashioned laptop. And it was the first time as well that there'd been a number of expeditions on the same route on Everest. And some of these sort of, people who are very well known in the media internationally, like John Krakauer and Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. So none of us really had any experience with being part of a disaster in the wilderness that is live. Yeah. It was probably the first time it ever happened. It was certainly the first time that Everest went live like this round the world, which meant that, nowadays we're much more used to that. We may not like it, but we're very used to news zipping around the world incredibly fast. Back then, we were still like, wait, what's happening? Who has an opinion? How do they know? We were caught between the age where we were still sending faxes, but we also had websites. Mm-hmm. And it meant that we were terribly ill prepared, not just the South Africans, everybody caught up in that storm, terribly ill prepared to deal with sort of worldwide media scrutiny in real time.
Yes. Amazing, Tibby. And yeah, it sounds completely overwhelming. So let's say the storm is, subsides there and things are starting to calm down. Is it becoming clear what's happened on the mountain? Are you starting to get reports in via the radio and so forth about what's going on there? And then are you also starting to get these reports in from, hey, here's what people are saying in South Africa or elsewhere around the world? Is it clear at that point that what's going on?
No, partly. It still then runs a good deal slower than it does now. So while still up at Camp 4, we got some idea eventually that some people had been killed. Some people were just missing. And of course, it takes some time for missing to mean dead. Initially it just means missing. So it wasn't clear for some time how many people had actually been killed. There wasn't that much communication between teams, so it wasn't clear to us at that point how many people had been injured or how badly or anything like that. So different climbers from different teams, because there are a number of teams on the mountain, more than is apparent in the film. So everybody sort of straggles their way back down to base camp. And it's really only in base camp that we begin to get a slightly bigger picture, and where we begin to have access to international media. Nobody's carrying personal satellite phones or anything then, the way they might be doing now. So it played out over a couple of days. There was enormous anger when the first helicopter to come into base camp turned out not to be a rescue helicopter for the injured, but to be a Japanese film crew, TV crew.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, I think for us, in a sense, the confusion continued for quite some time. And a lot of teams simply gave up and went home. So it's not as if we got to hear their stories. So I always did get the feeling that somehow the journalists who were 1,000 miles away or 10,000 miles away back in various first world countries seemed to be much more certain about what was going on than we were.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So then take us to, the unfortunate events of that tragedy are just behind you, and take us to that time when you, as a team, decided, well, I think we are going to go for this. And how long of a period was that, between the Everest disaster and then your decision to summit Everest?
Thing. It's going to be a slightly rough, but so we're probably back down at base camp around the 13th of May. Our team leader said, okay, everyone, don't talk about whether we go again or not. Just take a day or two, chill out, get in touch with your families, just take some time to process this and don't let's speculate about what we're going to do next. So we did that. And then he got us all together in the base camp mess tent sort of 2 days later and said, okay, individually, what do you want to do? No pressure either way. I mean, this is extraordinary, traumatic experience. And interestingly, every person said, we want to try again. And you can look at that and think, but that's just ridiculous. How could you? All this tragedy, the death, what's wrong with you guys? But I think there are two things to take on board. One is that Everest was as dangerous after the storm as it had been before the storm. That hasn't actually changed, the ways in which Everest is risky. Nor is Everest the only mountain that is deeply, potentially dangerous. All big wilderness environments are. You really, really shouldn't be on Everest if you haven't thought through what it means to try and manage this level of risk and what the consequences are if your management fails. So what we took away from surviving the storm was, okay, we didn't do anything particularly impressive or heroic or anything like that, but also we didn't panic, we didn't screw it up, we made good, safe, thoughtful decisions and got ourselves out of there in one piece. If we had good conditions, surely we could do that last little bit from the top camp to the top. So the idea was not to go back up there and think we could survive another storm. We didn't think that. The idea was to try and work our way back up the mountain and see if we could find ourselves a window of really good weather and grab that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what happened? Did you find that window?
Yes, we had to rework our logistics high up on the mountain. We went back up. Some slightly iffy weather came in. We hesitated. We missed an opportunity, the point where the IMAX movie guys got to the top. So we missed that opportunity. But we stayed at the third camp, and then we took the next window of good weather. We were the last team to the summit. We got to the top on the 25th of May, so 15 days after the terrible storm. And we were the only team above base camp. So when people look at Everest and talk about the crowds, we had this traditional, completely personal summit experience with good weather. So that was extraordinary. After all of this, from the whole stupid token woman competition thing, to the infighting in our own team, to the disaster of the storm, to trying again, to being the very last team left. We've only got a day or two before the Sherpas who keep the ladders in the icefall pull the ladders and say the season's over. So we're racing against a real time limit. So there's this amazing moment of, yes, we worked so hard for so long and we kept on trying and we kept coming back and it's worked. And then within 12 hours, it had all gone wrong again.
Mm-hmm. I want to back up just before we get to that part. You, was it on your route up to the summit, you got a phone call from someone, or was it right before you did that?
Yes, it was on our way back up. So we'd got ourselves back up to Camp 2. We were busy moving equipment further up the mountain. There was plenty of people in South Africa who thought this was a terrible idea. I mean, South Africa has no mountain culture, really. So when we claimed beforehand we're going to Everest and Everest is risky, it's like, yeah, of course it is. Yeah, everybody would say that. And then it turned out that, yes, it's actually risky. This is what risk looks like. It looks like, potentially climbers can get killed. People were horrified back in South Africa. So we've sort of gone back up against all common wisdom. And we get this phone call, and it has to be patched onto our radio system. So it's base camp on the radio saying, oh, it's President Nelson Mandela. It's like, yeah, no, of course it isn't, And it was. It was. Wow. We had our own personal Invictus moment. The president of South Africa phoned us up to say, guys, I am proud of you for trying again. I believe you can do this.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
How did that feel? I mean, that sounds completely surreal to be up on top of Mount Everest talking to Nelson Mandela. And to hear him say that, you know, like I remember hearing that in your other interview and thinking, oh my gosh, what is he going to say? Is he going to say, hey, you guys shouldn't do this? But no, he ended up saying, hey, I believe in you.
Yes, it was so affirming. And I think that was what was important. You know, we were walking our own path. We were trying to do something that we did think was reasonable, but there was so much negativity about it. And it does mean we were sort of constantly second guessing whether we were being realistic about this thing. And it's not that he had the faintest idea whether or not we could climb Everest. He had no idea. I mean, amazing guy, great political leader, not a mountain climber. But just for him to say that and say it publicly, because that phone call went out on radio in South Africa.
Wow.
So he's saying it publicly. And it's just that support. I mean, I think one of the toughest things about trying to live your hell yes life, whatever it is the number of people who will tell you, oh no, you know, but this, but that, it might go wrong. What if, you know, oh yes, other people can do that, but you, seriously? You know, there's so many ways in which well-meaning people in our lives undercut us. And, you know, that's not even counting the trolls in our lives. To have someone who matters to you stand up and say, yeah, you're doing good. I believe you can pull this off. That makes such a difference. We were so motivated after that.
I can imagine. So then take us, so you mentioned, maybe can you, again, I have the benefit or whatever you want to say of hearing that other interview. So I kind of know the story a little bit, but, tell us about what was it like from the summit or somewhere along there? Like, can you give us a visual picture of what it's like up there?
Well, all right, let me share with you the best moment, because people assume the summit is the best moment, but it's not. Because as soon as you get to the summit, you're immediately worrying about having to get back down again. You know, it's not a marathon. It's not over when you get to the top. So for me, I didn't approach Everest assuming I was going to get to the top. I was realistic about the fact I wasn't that experienced. This was a hell of a challenge for me. It would have been just arrogant. It would have been naive to go like, yeah, me, summit of Everest, not a problem. So I was there going, I am here to learn. Every day on the mountain, every meter higher, I have more experience, and that's amazing. I will come away from this expedition a much better climber, much more experienced, however high I get. And that's what I was chasing. And I kind of thought, well, maybe I'll hit my limit. And that's useful to know. You know, people have limits. I don't believe in if you dream it, you can do it. You know, we can do much more than we think, but there are nevertheless realistic physical, mental, logistical limits to what's possible. And I thought one of the things I might find out is when I got and said, you know, this climb is too hard. I can't do this anymore. And the one thing you can't see for almost the entire climb is you can't see the final ridge to the summit. It's hidden. And it's a knife edge. It's got these drops on either side of, you know, something like 2,500 meters, 3,000 meters. In the middle of it is a famous rock step that you've got to climb up called the Hillary Step. And everybody's always terribly worried about whether they're going to be able to climb the Hillary Step at sort of whatever it is, 8,700 meters. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, we've left at midnight, so it's been a long, slow, cold, dark climb. 8 o'clock in the morning, I come over the top of a thing called the South Summit, which is like a little mini summit. And for the first time, I can see the knife edge ridge. I can see the Hillary step. I can see that beyond the Hillary step is the summit. And I looked at that ridge and I thought, I can do that. That's fine. I can do that. And it was that moment, the moment when I looked at it and I thought, this is going to work. I am, within a couple of hours, I am going to have climbed Everest. That was the best moment of the entire climb.
Yeah, not the actual summiting, but the moment when you realize I can do this. Yeah. Right. That's interesting. I just to pause there. I can imagine. I don't know if you use that in your corporate presentations, but I can imagine that as a metaphor in people's lives about this. What a great metaphor, as a matter of fact. Of course, what bigger accomplishment could there be than climbing Everest? Few, I would say. But the idea of trying to do it is so intimidating. But when you break it down into the small steps, and there you are near the end after having taken these small steps. Wait, now you can see that this little bit left is something that I can accomplish.
Oh yes, the small step thing is one of the real learning lessons for me from mountain climbing, and I do take it back into the rest of my life, because I sit there with big plans, and I just think, but there's so much work I have to do, and it's so far away, and, it's going to take years before I see any success from this idea. And you go like, yeah, that's what mountains are like. You take one step. A step is 20 centimeters. I mean, 20 centimeters is just silly. 20 centimeters is nothing. Mm-hmm. But you put them together, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, and eventually you look back and you're standing, 2 hours short of the summit of Everest, and the journey you've come has just disappeared down into the clouds beneath you. And putting those steps together, putting one foot in front of the other, chasing not just the big goal, but chasing the next camp, the next hour. I mean, sometimes I'm busy counting 100 steps at a time on a mountain. Anything to keep yourself moving forward.
I imagine that's something about that people love about mountain climbing, or I know I do about, traveling or hiking or something like that. I haven't done anything close to what you've done, but that sort of that visceral feeling of that thing that we experience as a metaphor in our, work lives or whatever. But it's just really that taking that next step, literally taking that next step. So that's amazing. Well, okay. So let's I would love, that the happy ending would have been there on the summit, but as you said, within 12 hours, things had started to fall apart again. So what happened then?
Basically, one of our team died on the descent. And this is a fairly long, complicated story. But he went missing. And we didn't know where he was. And we didn't have the resources to try and mount a search party. And we eventually had to declare him missing, presumed dead. And that is, it was terrible on all sorts of levels. I mean, there's the sheer trauma of losing a lovely guy and a close friend. There's kind of the guilt about we're a team. You second guess all the decisions you made. But it's one thing to say with hindsight, oh, this would have been different, that would have been different. At the time, you kind of understand why we ended up where we did. But still, the wishing you could change history, the wishing you could have made a different choice, that never leaves. Then there's just that lovely, beautiful, exciting summit moment is just gone. Because how do you get to go home and be all excited and proud about being the first South Africans to climb Everest, when this has happened? So sort of selfishly, there's that sense of the loss of what had been this extraordinary life moment. And, all of that is just personal to us in the team. Then you go down and walk straight into the media storm of blame and finger pointing and whose fault is it and what happened. And when your answer is, we're not sure what happened, the assumption is you're lying, you're hiding something. But the truth is there are good many things that happen in life where the answer is we're not sure what happened.
So now I'd like to pull out a little bit, Cathy, and really, I would just ask you the question because, this is the thing about our hell yes lives, right? Or our hell yeses. Like, obviously, mountain climbing is something that is so much a hell yes for you. But other people, if they had experiences like the ones that you've had, they might have thought, I'm not meant to do this, or they might have been discouraged. But instead, you've gone on, haven't you? And you've climbed other mountains, you've returned to Everest, and you've really continued because of that love of mountain climbing. Can you talk a little bit about that? Just, and maybe again with our listeners in mind about things that maybe they've had challenges with their passion or with something, and they're thinking about giving up, but they've continued on.
I think one of the challenges of trying to live, I know what you call a hell yes or a self-directed life, is that it's not easy. It turns out to be difficult in all sorts of ways. Things can go dramatically wrong because you are trying to walk a path that's kind of a little different from what many of your peers are doing within their lives. There's likely to be a good deal of finger pointing and criticism and, oh yeah, but this went wrong and that went wrong and you've stuffed that one up and, oh, do you really think you should be doing this again? And you've got to think about, are they right? Maybe they are right. But you've also got to think about, well, if I've decided I think they're wrong, why? So we've talked about death and disaster and, anyone who hits Google will know that that isn't the only difficult expedition I've been involved in. And again, it doesn't have to be Everest for people to get killed or hurt in the wilderness. The wilderness is a dangerous place, potentially. So what's it about? And my answer, I think, is I like two things. I'm curious about moving into these beautiful but unpredictable environments and trying to find a safe way through. And I enjoy the puzzle. And it's both a physical puzzle. People always think about, the sheer physical training and the fitness and the strength you need. But it's also a mental puzzle to understand this environment and find your way through it safely. And I find that fascinating. And I come out of these challenges. And sometimes, most of the time, they end well. I climb the mountain I wanted to climb. Nothing goes wrong. The team comes home friends. We're planning the next project. Sometimes, very rarely, somebody is killed. I've only once lost a team member and I've once got caught up in somebody else's tragedy. And sometimes we fail. I've backed off mountains because it just got too difficult or too dangerous. And you go like, well, I got the experience, but I didn't manage what I'd hoped to manage. And you've got to try and, live with that disappointment. But I learn so much. I learn about what I'm capable of, and I get to learn it in these extraordinary environments. I come back from these trips feeling challenged, alive, proud, confident, feeling my horizons have been stretched, my capacity has been stretched. And I can take that increased confidence, that increased sense of my own potential, and move on to the next interesting idea.
Does that translate, do you think, I know we're focusing on Everest, but I know that you've climbed many different mountains and done all kinds of amazing things. But when you come back from something like that, do you just feel like you could just take on the world in everyday life? Like you don't have any problem walking up to somebody and saying, "Hi, I'm Cathy." I found that even in just the little steps that I take, even in launching this podcast, just the feeling of, wow, I feel empowered by the fact that I brought something into the world that didn't exist before. So what else can I do? Do you get that kind of a feeling?
Yes. However, I don't know whether you found this one out yet, but it's not a golden bullet. I absolutely have more confidence, bigger ambitions, bigger goals because of the things I've done in the mountains. And I'm more resilient about failure as well. That was actually, I got two big things, I think, from the first Everest expedition. The one was much more confidence about my ability to climb mountains, but also just to manage really difficult, circumstances. Everything from the media to the infighting in the team to the motivation to keep moving up the mountain. But the other thing, it was a massive failure. I mean, yes, we got to the top of the mountain, but, Bruce got killed and all these things went wrong and it got played out in the media. In many ways, it was a massive public failure. And it was horrible to have to go through it, but it was really quite liberating because I think up to then I'd been too inclined to play it safe. I think one of the things most people are terrified of is being seen to fail in front of their peers, being judged by other people to be a failure. And I survived that experience and realized, hey, life goes on. And in among all the negativity was enormous opportunity. So I've taken away much greater confidence in my ability to succeed and much greater confidence in my ability to survive failure. And therefore I'm prepared to try things where I suspect that there's a good chance we'll fail. And that's okay. As long as I learn something by having, taken on the challenge. As long as I come home with more than I had when I left. And I'm talking about skill, experience. It doesn't matter if I don't get the final goal.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think resiliency is the word that it sounds like you that comes up in everything that you're talking about there. I was reading as a side note, I was reading something in a book recently. They were talking about rejection therapy, and it was these people that were going out to kind of like steel themselves to rejection. They would just go out and do things that they knew they would be rejected to just kind of work that muscle, right? And it sounds like you have definitely gone through some trial by fire and come out the other side. So you're a very inspiring example of that. Hell Yes Lifers, if there's things out there that you're afraid to do, just think of Cathy and everything that she's gone through. And here she is talking to me on the other side of it. You can do it too. Face your fears. Let me ask you this. So as we start to wind down, I always like to ask, you've done so much. I'd be almost tempted to say, oh, well, you're living your Hell Yes life and that's it. But I always like to ask people to look towards the future. Is there anything, and what I call this is your cringeworthy vision. So this is a vision that's so big that you cringe just thinking about telling people about it. And now here's a chance to tell our audience about it. If you have anything like that in mind, do you have any big visions?
Well, I think
if not, no pressure.
Yes and no. Because I'm not terribly goal-driven. I'm more interested in the journey. So I don't think I'm one for going, yes, I publicly declare that this is my enormously embarrassing, over-ambitious vision. Hold me accountable. I really don't. I don't think like that. I'm more interested in working my journey. So in some senses, I think I'm in the middle of my cringeworthy vision, which is this life, which is 100%, self-employed, has been all my adult life. I think I'm probably unemployable at this point. And, I've got many years ahead of me. That's many years of which I still have to pay the bills and bring in income and make this weird combination of adventure and motivation and storytelling work. And that remains scary. I've done it for 20 years and I'm still scared about, what the next 10 years and the next 20 years looks like, particularly as our world changes really fast. So in one sense, I feel that I'm living my cringeworthy vision. In another sense, I am trying to build something which might interest some of your listeners.
Sure.
Which is one of my projects for this year is to build a website that I'm calling The Business of Adventure. So it's thebusinessofadventure.com. And it's about how you fund an adventurous life. Because let's face it, there are plenty of people doing the kind of rah-rah motivation of, yeah, hell yes, let's live this amazing, different life. And then you tell people and your mother goes, yeah, but how are you going to pay for it? And it's a good question. And I'm trying to build a website that helps for adventurers particularly answer that question. Hell yes, do your adventure. Now let's talk about how you're going to pay for it. Let's be practical.
Right. Yeah. Let's get some nuts and bolts in here and let's figure out how we're going to make that happen. Right.
So I'm trying to build a resource to help people answer those questions. It's a journey I'm going to be on through the rest of this year and in the years to come. I do feel like I'm right at the bottom of my mountain, trying to count my 20 centimeter steps. But if any of your listeners would like to join me on that journey, share with me kind of their challenges and the information they're looking for, I'd love to talk to them.
Oh, lovely. And so is that website live, businessofadventure.com?
It'll be live in a week or two.
Oh, okay, great. Well, we could. This will probably air in a few weeks, so we can just be in touch and just let me know when it's live, and we'll make sure and put the links in the show notes so people can get there for sure. I'll bet there's some adventurers out there that would love a little help. Let me ask you this then: is there any action that you would recommend someone listening to this podcast take if they wanted to take a meaningful step towards their hell yes life? Whether that would be something similar to what you've done or something completely different?
I think one of the hardest things about stepping out of the groove and wandering off into the wilderness to pursue your hell yes vision is being sure you're pursuing the right vision, in a sense, because this is risky. You know, there's quite a lot to lose in trying to do this. And we live in a society that I think is terribly obsessed with success, but rapid, dramatic, media-worthy success. And I think the downside of kind of the hell yes vision can be a little bit the feeling that if you aren't managing to live a hell yes life right now and have 10,000 social media followers who are going like, wow, you're amazing, you're a failure. Mm-hmm, and it's like there's just too much pressure and it's too unrealistic. So it's taking the time to be really thoughtful about what does hell yes mean to you? Yeah. And so that it's your hell yes. It's not something that you're pursuing because it looks cool or it's all over Instagram or your friends seem to think it would be great, or, hell yes can be quiet. It can be small. Mm-hmm. It can be something that unfolds over time. It doesn't have to mean burning the house down right this minute and, declaring yourself liberated and striding off into the wilderness. Yeah, things can go wrong with that. Nothing wrong with planning. Nothing wrong with taking a bit of time to think it through. Nothing wrong with trying to get a team around you to help support you in your vision, but also to, ask you some of the tough questions like, how are you going to pay for it? So
absolutely.
Dream the big dreams, but take the time to think, is this really my dream? And okay, what does it take, step by step, day by day, year by year, to make this dream move towards reality?
Yeah, I think that's a great point and a great perspective on that, because I always, obviously hell yes life, it just sounds like, hey, let's live this huge life. But no, what is your hell yes? And your hell yes could be meditating all day. It could be, basket weaving or knitting scarves. It could be anything. And I always try to come back to this phrase, this quote by Howard Thurman. He says, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do it, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So it's really about that, like what makes you come alive, and for you, it's mountain climbing. For someone else, it could be, meditating. That's a great point. And it's really, I love what you're saying about those small steps too. No one's going to have 10,000 followers on Facebook overnight. Right. So, and who cares really? So, well, Cathy, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking taking the time and sharing your story. Can you tell us where is the best place on the internet we can find you?
Right. The website, cathyo'dowd.com. I'm active on social media, Twitter at Cathy O'Dowd, Instagram at Cathy O'Dowd, or find me on Facebook.
Excellent. And we will have links in the show notes. And Cathy, to close out our time, I always like to say hell yes together on the count of 3 with my guests. Are you ready to do that?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. 1, 2, 3.
Hell yes.
Hell yes. All right, Cathy, thanks so much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Hell Yes Life podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite RSS feed. If you like the show, please leave a rating and review. And if you want to stay connected, visit hellyeslife.com and sign up for the e-newsletter and private Facebook group. Again, I'm Norman Bell. Thanks for joining me. Now let's get out there and live a hell yes life.